I know that we are obviously trying to condense a lot of information here when we talk about the history of these practices. But what can you teach us about where some of these ideas come from?
Ah, okay. Well, for a very long time, sex and mystical experiences was pretty normal. And the idea of sex and magic is fairly new. And you can see the progression over time of how each thing influenced each thing. Um, and there's this very common theme overall that, it starts off with like the creation myths from the old times, right?
Hmm.
Uh, I don't know. I'm having a hard time putting my words together right now. Um, it's just, it's been a ongoing story and history to the part of our human existence.
Yeah, fair to say. I mean, I think that it's almost impossible to even get into the mindset of some of the prehistorical belief systems and different things that contributed to this. I mean, we're obviously talking about practices that in many ways are as old as humanity itself. But for our more modern times, whether we're talking about tantra or sex magic or some of these other things, what should we understand about the philosophy or maybe the goal of these practices? What are some of the, I guess, universal objectives that people are seeking or the needs that are seeking to be met here?
Ah, well, it's kind of interesting because I'm not exactly. There is this. Well, let me think about this. Um, in there's tantra that's Buddhist and also Hindi, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they have very different approaches. And like I said, I haven't studied either of them, but there is, in general, I think of yoga, and yoga is this union of our higher selves to our lower selves. It's this idea that there is uh, something divine that we can associate with. Like, for instance, with the Kiss of the Yogini book, what I found so interesting is that way back when, the higher caste Brahmins would have sex with these yoginis that would, uh, uh, raise their level of connection from just being, men to being divine men, right?
Hmm.
And eventually, that didn't work out. Only a small number of people were able to access these rights, and they wanted to make them for everyone. So they got internalized into chakras. Now, if you look at chakras and their history, there's like, I don't know how many different systems, at least seven that I know of. And chakras just represent this idea that, yes, we're human, but we can reach some kind of um, understanding of something divine. Now, what that divine is, it's in that, like I want to refer to the Zohar, um, which is a text from the 13th century. Um, it symbolizes the sexual unity of the husband and wife as divine and treated with deep respect. And this divine union elevates the mind of the husband to the divine realm, drawing down the divine light and the Shekinah herself, descending into the semen. Now, this is the 13th century, but it's not much different from, you know, uh, 5th century Tantra, if I have that right, and I have
Hmm.
to get my dates. Um, uh,
Should we take much from the, seemingly like universality of some of these explorations?
oh, I love that question. Yeah, why not? You know, um, it's kind of neat to um, think about sex from a different perspective, that somehow it can liberate us. That if we stop to think about all of the things that limit us and our ability to experience our own pleasure, to own our own pleasure, and to share pleasure with others. Yeah, look into some of these practices. They can help liberate us from the limiting beliefs that we hold.
Hmm. Well, I know that we have touched on Tantra in particular. Are there some other like significant ideas that have come up through the ages? What are some of the broad overviews of like the general schools of thought on these subjects?
Okay. So before I go there, let me say more about this liberation.
Sure.
Really, the Zohar really fed into my understanding is that it kind of fed into the idea of um, the Catholic Mass. And, you know, it is a liberating idea to take something and to transform it, right? Um, and you see this all throughout history. Alchemy, for example, used to be these old guys, trying to, create gold, right? Let's take all these metals and turn them into gold. But eventually, alchemy came to represent a more spiritual, internal aspect. We turn ourselves into a better person through these practices. Everything that I have studied and read is really all about um, liberation and transformation. Now, what happens to each of these things that I've studied is that they're all encased in their own school of thought, of
Hmm.
how that happens. So you either buy into that school of thought or you don't, but I think at least knowing the school of thought helps you better to understand what you're buying into.
Yeah, and I like to imagine some of these things as a framework, just as a lens for trying to understand how other people have experienced their sexuality. As a therapist, like I am often in the role of asking people about these like really deep and sophisticated and oftentimes like ineffable parts of themselves as they're trying to discuss or describe a feeling. And they're often like stumbling around awkwardly trying to put these emotions into words. And then I'm trying to take what they're giving me and, in some form or fashion, unravel it or just get a sense of what they're after. Communication is incredibly challenging. I think it is the most fascinating, most beautiful aspect of our species. The fact that we have all of these different complex languages, the fact that we have this body language, that our intonation, that all of the ideas that we are able to communicate simply by pushing air through our diaphragm or from our diaphragm and through our lungs, vibrating our vocal cords, all into a syntax and a communication system to somehow take the ideas that are in our heads and to put them into somebody else's heads. It's a kind of magic all unto itself. And so oftentimes when we look at some of these practices, what's interesting to me is to see how other people describe their sexuality or describe their love or their romance or their connection to others, simply as a way of trying to get myself into somebody else's eyes or inside of somebody else's skull. Are there, other strategies for other ways that these tools can be useful?
Hmm. Well, let me think about this. I'm not sure which tools. You mean spiritual tools and magical tools and religious tools?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I am trying to get across is just that it is incredibly difficult to talk about love, incredibly difficult to talk about sexuality. Sex is such a complex idea. Love is a incredibly complex idea. I mean, the different versions of it that my clients sort of parade in front of me week in and week out is just baffling. And so I see a lot of these practices as a detailed description of one particular person's or one particular culture's way of understanding those things. And so even if I don't necessarily resonate with those ideas, or even if some of those ideas don't pass muster in certain like scientific ways, somebody said them for a reason and somebody described themselves that way for a reason. And I just see it as a form of like symbolic language for better understanding somebody. And by exploring Tantra and some of these other practices, I think we develop like a lexicon that we can share with our partners in order to better communicate. And I guess I'm wondering if that's a valid use of these tools.
Mm. I love your focus on communication. What comes up for me is the fact that tied to communication is the way we think and feel and
Mm-hmm.
experience the world. So, yeah, I guess it's important to communicate. But often what I do is I focus on the individual person. And uh, the thought that comes to mind is I went to Peru, and in Peru, you have these old Inca temples where the Spanish built the churches right on top. They leveled them until about a foot, and then they built their church on top of it. And if you go inside these churches, temples, you'll see that the Last Supper is painted. And instead of the turkey that I'm used to seeing at the Last Supper, there's gooey, which is, flattened. Um, what is gooey? I've already forgotten in Spanish, but it's just flattened meat, and
Mm.
it's just flattened on a platter. These we can't ever assume what anybody's religion or spiritual practices are. We can't ever know really the in-depth knowledge that goes behind some of these beliefs and ideas. So, yes, it can give us a language to communicate with, um, but I think really we should always be in search of meaning.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're obviously talking about some, very ancient practices and some very deeply rooted historical things. When does the modern world of sexual spirituality begin to take shape? Whether we're talking about the perhaps more huckster leaning, like less believable forms of it, or things that are more rooted in tradition, or things that may even be more rooted in practical science. When do we see what we would like kind of currently understand as sacred sexuality, or some of these other things begin to take shape?
Ah, that's a tough one. It used to be that we would tell kids if they masturbated, their palms would get hairy,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, I was
Um,
definitely told that I would go blind.
oh, there you go. Gosh, and you're young.
Yeah.
So, and that's a focus on people with penises, not necessarily people
Hmm.
with vaginas, because
Yeah, because girls don't masturbate, right? Yeah, naturally.
no, we have no sexuality, of course. So, um, really, even today, our sexual understanding is very limited because research is very limited because it's not highly funded. So, there's a lot of questions that can be asked here about sexuality, both from its evolution and spiritual practices or its meaning for humans. But what I really think is happening now and has been is that we just have introduced more of these ideas because, Tantra wasn't brought to Americas until like the 19th century. And that came out slowly. And we can trace who introduced these things and how they got out to the public, if you do the research. Um, and once more people start getting exposed to this, it either gets a lot of pushback and or a lot of interest. Now, some people in the early 19th century ran with it. They're like, oh, look at this cool stuff. Sacred sexuality, sex magic, oh la la. A very Victorian time frame, like, anything but these corsets and these terrible modern rules that we had at the time. But as time has grown, we're finding a little bit more space to um, be more sexual, to explore our sexual selves a little bit more. We still don't even have language for what two women do together in sexual intimacy,
Yeah.
or what people who are gender diverse are doing in sexual diversity. And we need to expand that knowledge base, that word base, that understanding. And to do that, we have to be always curious about what these things mean to the individual rather than just looking at the whole thing, calling it crap, and moving on.
Yeah. So, is there value then in adapting some of these older, more traditional viewpoints or paradigms? Is there vocabulary that we can maybe grab, or even just metaphor or modeling, symbolic language, or anything else that we might be able to kind of pull from the past and bring up with us into the current to, I guess, to feed our like impoverished word base here?
Yeah, I cringe a little bit because I'm thinking of in my lifetime and in my search for meaning and understanding, some really craptacular, unethical people that I've run into.
Sure.
And I'm not encouraging everyone to go out and join the Hare Krishnas and do whatever else. And I really want people to uh, really use their brain cells to figure out how to safely and sanely and consensually, enjoy their experience on this earth. Um, so, yes, my short answer is yes. I take practices from alchemy, I take practices from ceremonial magic, I take practices from just an innumerable number of places. Um, and what I mostly use all of those for is mindfulness
Hmm.
so that I can be more present in my sexuality. Um, and that includes meditation, grounding exercises, creative visualization. I'm trained in neurolinguistic programming and hypnosis. Um, all of these things are tools to help us connect deeper to ourselves. Study modern analysis to really work with unconscious motivations from early childhood. Like, I am really all about learning the most about myself. And that means being open to, I mean, not ridiculously open to, but open to things that really speak to me. So, it may not speak to others though.
Yeah, is there a not a litmus test necessarily, but is there any strategies that you might recommend for how to incorporate these things without finding yourself like too far down the well?
I don't know how to avoid going too far down the well. That seems to be my specialty. Um,
Fair to say.
Yeah, I remember one time I was running a group, and a group member gave me a button that says, "I'm just someone who likes to learn," and it's true. I just love to learn. But um, from some of the negative experiences I have had with people who are doing things out there that I don't find wholly ethical, um, my idea is to tell people is to research ideas and books in the library, talk to friends, get ideas, talk to a therapist who specializes in this sexuality, like get some ideas before you just go out and join the next cult or sign up for the next orgasm class anywhere. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, ultimately, how should we understand some of these practices? I mean, are they religions? Are they rudimentary forms of science? Are they metaphors or symbols, or what else could we use to describe some of the things we're talking about here?
Mm, yeah. I was just watching a video on Tantra where this person was talking about um, ways to understand Tantra. And before you can get there, you have to practice some ideas on uh, non harm, compassion. I don't know all the things that go into it, but um, I think every time the video goes straight on me, I get anxious. And then, Christy, can you tell me again what your question was?
Yeah, I guess I am just trying to find what category, what box we might be able to
Oh,
put some of these things in.
yeah, but how is that box helpful though? Like, what does that
Yeah,
mean?
and that's fair to say. Like, I don't know that we are talking about religions. I don't know that it's entirely fair to say that we're talking about science, even rudimentary science. But I do know that these practices have some value, and it's difficult to categorize. And a lot of what we're discussing, I feel like, has already gotten pretty esoteric and pretty uh, difficult to conceptualize. And so, any container that you might be able to give us, so that we can walk away from this conversation with a sense of maybe how to understand these things and how to navigate this like kind of pseudo scientific world.
Yeah, I can tell you the container. The container is you. Um, my practices and beliefs go through the filter of my psychology training.
Mm,
So, you know, what most of these practices do for me is help me regulate my nervous system, help me be more present in my body rather than anxiously running off in my mind. Um, they help me shift my perspective on how I see myself. For the longest time, I identified as agnostic, and I felt kind of separated from the rest of the world who had giant communities, right? Giant communities. And here I am, agnostic, and I don't have any community. And not only that, I felt like crap because now I'm just nobody with nothing.
mm.
But the thing about me for being Gnostic is that I was able to reclaim something that's ultimately larger than myself, whether it be something I aspire to, whether it be something I just really want to embody for myself. And that allowed me to love myself more. Now, not everybody needs that. Not everybody needs to look at all these practices that they might come across as being psychologically motivated. Um, some people want to believe in angels. Some people want to believe in the spirits and do Native American rituals that bring them into the dark caves, into the underground to visit the ancestors. I really, we can't study those empirically, but we do have our own containers and find our own meaning. And I think that's important to recognize and honor that we each do our own thing to try to get through this world.
Yeah, I really like that lens for understanding all of this. Are there any particular practices that you might want to mention? You don't necessarily have to demonstrate them for us, but I guess I'll go ahead and mention that like tantric massage and yab yum are two things that my partner and I have found to be incredibly opening and powerful just in our desire to connect with one another. Is there anything that you might mention to the audience who might be curious or interested to explore some of these things?
Yeah. Um, Meditation, which is really paying attention to intentional focus.
Mm,
Um, Eye gazing, shared breathing,
mm-hmm,
um, uh, focusing on meditations that are guided, that have the idea of pleasure. Um, Most of the work that I've done to understand practices uh, and beliefs that I practice um, have meant that I have to pay attention to how I think about myself, think about the world, how I consider my sexual health, how I feel deserving of love. There are so many things that go into uh, being able to be having sex with the lights on in the bodies that we inhabit, with the stress that we're under, anything that helps us to just be in the moment rather than worried about our performance or worried about our bills. Those are the things that I would really,
yeah.
really just take as much as you can from any system anywhere.
Sure, and we'll make sure to have a, handful of those practices or some descriptions in the show notes for this episode. But where else can folks go to learn more about some of these practices? Are there any websites or resources or other information that you might want to point people towards?
Nope. Um, you know, I really want this to be everyone's journey. And, there are organizations, I talk to couples all the time about expanding their erotic canvas by maybe looking into um, uh, kink that will help them feel more connected. And the thing is that um, I can't, I can lead them places to go, but ultimately, I think it's a very personal discussion and
Hmm.
conversation and figuring out where people's interests are and then helping them figure out what might be good resources for that, how to figure out primary sources and secondary sources. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, I don't have all the places. But I think if people are curious and they're interested, then yeah, reach out to me, reach out to you. We'll help them figure it out, right? Because we don't
Yeah,
want to steer them in the wrong direction.
fair to say. Well, I know that no matter how many times we say that we are, not embracing the supernatural or talking about anything that can't be understood or experienced on a personal level, that there are plenty of folks watching who are probably laughing and still feeling incredibly skeptical. And I guess I'm just curious if there's anything in particular that you would want to say to those folks.
Mm, yeah. It's okay to laugh, and you have every right to set up barriers to anything your mind just doesn't want to deal with. I totally get it. If you're a little curious, I would ask you to pay attention to that curiosity and nurture it. That's all.
Yeah. No, well said. Any other final thoughts that you'd like to leave with the audience tonight before we wrap up?
Ah, everyone deserves pleasure. I do not say this enough. Everyone deserves pleasure, and there are many ways to come to it. And it doesn't have to just be, you know, um, missionary on the bed. There's a lot of ways to get outside of that. And some of these practices, um, bless them all, are things that help us get outside of our little box on how we think things should always be. They can be more.
Incredibly well said. Well, thank you so very much. I'd love to tell people where they can learn more about your work. We'll get some links up on the screen, but where should people be looking for you around the web?
Oh, www.hillcountrytherapy.com. That's me. And I'm Melissa Hargrave. I am a psychotherapist um, and adventurer in this wide world that we have. You can find me in the Austin area. I do teletherapy and in person.